15. I'm Adam Kadri, and if you haven't listened to Ask Tell number 14, then you should do that, unless you're just here for the delightful wallpaper segment, because we're jumping back into the segment on the Baron in mid-conversation. There's like an hour's worth of lead-up to what you're about to hear on the other side of the music cue. But if you did just listen to all of that, then here's the rest. Yeah, I guess I could get on board with your idea of having a box of warnings that you can open or not, depending on whether you're open to being surprised. But I also imagine that there would be works of mine in which I would have filled that box with something like, nope, there may or may not be surprises here, not gonna tell you what they might or might not be, proceed at your own risk. If you have any triggers for anything, back out now. And if that means you miss out on playing a game that wouldn't have triggered you, well, every day can't be sunshine. And I guess that's sort of what we get in The Baron, which just says, The Baron is about a tragic and possibly shocking theme. And even that undermines the potential power of the opening, because it looks like it's just a faux medieval knight versus dragon sort of thing. But if you go into it thinking, I mean, getting killed by a dragon might be tragic, but normally you don't get a warning about how shocking it might be for a knight to get roasted, so this is probably not what it seems, which undermines the surprise when it turns out to be a dream sequence.
So I think when talking about The Baron, I think interactive fiction is such a challenging medium for transgressive storytelling, where you're putting the player into the shoes of this horrible character. And for me, it's because there's such a strong connection between the player and character that it can create this feeling of complicity between the player's choices and the character's choices. And especially in a game like this that doesn't really let you off the hook very much for what this guy is thinking and doing. Like, you don't have very many choices until maybe the end of the game for how you tackle these different puzzles and these different set pieces that you're moving through. So I found it honestly really uncomfortable and disturbing to play as this character and to have the agency to steer him through his world.
This topic hits close to home for me because I think I was the first person to start talking about the notion of complicity in interactive fiction. Maybe someone can find a post that predates mine, but I think I was the one to introduce it into the IF critical vocabulary. Because when I first started poking around in the IF world, it was still back in the day when people were just writing puzzles. And I started trying to push the idea that, no, you don't have to recreate the Babelfish puzzle to tell an interactive story. And there were some other folks who were experimenting with puzzleless IF. And some of these early attempts were what I guess today would be called kinetic rather than interactive. You weren't really making any choices, and you got the same story every time. And I remember that there was a lot of pushback. You know, what's the point of this? How is this even IF? Why not just write it as a short story? And my answer was that there's a difference between reading Ethel kicked the cat, or even you kick the cat, and actually typing kick cat. And if that's not optional to advance the story, you actually do still always have a choice. You can choose to either type the command or quit the game. And if you do type the command, then to some degree, you are complicit in what the character does. And I sort of feel as though The Baron actually provides less complicity than some other works of IF, in the degree to which things come into play based on the commands that you type into the game. For instance, in The Baron, I'm confronted by a wolf, much like in Photopia. If I decide to kill the wolf and discover that I've left an orphaned pup, then I'm responsible for that. But on the other hand, and it kind of had to be this way because I doubt it would have been publishable otherwise, raping the daughter is something the main character does in the backstory. And so I don't know that I really feel responsible for that just because I happen to have booted up the game and been told that I'm playing this character.
Makes sense.
And I suppose that there's an argument to be made that if you read this and don't immediately quit the game, that the complicity begins there. But I'm not sure that I agree. I'm not 100% sure that I disagree. But right now I'm leaning toward the idea that that idea takes you down a path that says that if you're Anthony Hopkins and you agree to play Hannibal Lecter in a movie, then you're complicit in cannibalism. I don't think that wanting to see what Victor Heispers actually has to say through this story makes anyone complicit in or even complacent about child sexual abuse.
You are making me feel so much better about my life decisions right now. Yeah, you persuaded me not to feel bad about the limited choices this game gave me while playing this horrible character. For me, there were a couple of details in the gameplay that maybe gave me that feeling of complicity more so than others. Like the conversations were like, whatever, you're kind of on rails through those menus. But the one that really struck me was that there's a puzzle at the start of the game where you're at the main character's house and the daughter's missing. And before you leave, you have the option to go look at the daughter's bedroom. And there's a locked diary there. And it took me forever. I kind of got really into the puzzle of how to get the diary open. And eventually I figured out that the way you get the diary open is you have to lie down in the daughter's bed. And then you find the key underneath the pillow and you're able to unlock the diary and read what's in there. And I remember the minute I solved the puzzle, I felt so much guilt over the fact that I had temporarily, while solving the puzzle, lost track of what the game was actually about. And I was so into the gamification of it and the achievement of solving the puzzle. And then when I opened the diary and read it and saw what was in the diary, I felt so incredibly bad that I'm like, oh man. I regretted solving the puzzle at all. And so that's for me where the game really got me. A couple little moments like that.
That's interesting. I mentioned Infidel earlier, and that was a project that played with the tension between story and game. As far as I'm aware, it was the first big title to say, hey, you know what? Being a standard early 1980s text adventure character who's running around the map stealing loads of treasures, that actually makes you a jerk. But the author is hoping that you get so caught up in the game side of things, solving all the puzzles, that you do steal all the treasures and are then surprised when you get punished for being a jerk. But with the Baron, I kind of got the sense that the author was trying to avoid that. It's sort of leaden and dour and seems to go to great pains to make it clear that this is no frivolous game. Understandably enough, he's dealing with a serious topic and wants the experience to reflect that. But I don't know, I think there are better ways to set that tone without writing stuff that reads like, here you are in this grim world, thinking grimly about the grimness of your life.
What it reminded me of, though, years ago, I used to edit a short fiction magazine, and there's something called the slush pile, which is when you send a story into a magazine for consideration. The slush pile is where all the stories are sitting, and usually there's someone called a slush reader whose job it is to go and sort out the slush pile and try to get the stories that might interest the editor from the ones that just aren't suitable for the magazines or the ones that are just really bad or you think are offensive. And most of the time you get about 1 to 5% in the slush pile of stories that are really, 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 really insulting, like not just bad, but kind of upsetting. Speaking about the prose style of this one, it's funny because it reminded me a little bit of the experience of running across one of those stories in the slush pile, but like a good version of that. Like you run across this really upsetting story that actually knows it's upsetting, because the worst part about finding those stories in the wild is that usually the people who write them don't seem terribly aware of what they've written. And maybe for me, that's why I agree with you about the prose being purple. For me, it felt like part of the point. It felt like, yep, I feel like I am in the head of a certain kind of guy, because that's sort of how the texts look that when these guys actually sit down to write short stories, I guess.
What most struck me about the Baron wasn't even the style so much as the structure. Like I was talking about a few minutes ago, back in the 90s, when people were first starting to experiment with puzzle-less games, a lot of critics charged, well, this isn't really interactive. The author's just reading a short story at me, and every so often I have to type "go north" because the text said it's time to go north. But otherwise, I'm not doing anything. I'm not making any choices. I'm not affecting the story in any way. So that's one way a piece of IF can be one-sided. The author has a story to tell, and the player doesn't actually contribute much. And so, essentially, entering the commands is just the same as turning pages. But the Baron is the opposite. This is a game in which the author doesn't contribute much. Look at the contrast between the Baron and a game that appeared in episode 13 of this show, Float Point by Emily Short. Emily sets up an ethical dilemma. You've come to this colony world because the climate is collapsing, and you have to decide whether to evacuate the colonists back to Earth, even though the reason they went into exile in the first place is that their cultural practices are abhorrent to most people back on Earth. So you have to figure out, am I going to bring them back? Am I going to let them die? Am I going to try to find a third way? You have to decide on a combination of responses, and there are actually 12 different options for what you can do. And the 13th is to not make a proper decision and leave everybody confused. But depending on what you pick, Emily has written a vignette tailored to the combination that you've selected. And that's your ending. You get a couple of pages of denouement that lay out the effect of what you did. So that's what I thought the Baron was going to do. I'd make my way through this philosophical dialogue, making ethical and moral choices, and then the game would tell me how the story goes from there. What happens in my later life? Instead, it says the end. There is literally no response whatsoever to your choices. And I guess the idea is that, being a good philosopher, you're just supposed to sort of sit back and close the game and reflect upon what you chose. And I can see how that might be a strategy to keep players from just mechanically cranking through every combination of options just to see all the different rewards. Because I have to admit, that's how I played Float Point. I got to the end, and instead of making a carefully considered moral decision, I just tried every combination because I wanted to see all the vignettes. But if the ending is always just the end, there's not much point to that. You might want to see what menu options you get if you explore a different branch, and I did poke at the final scene for a bit for that reason. But if Victor was trying to get away from the idea of handing out rewards for trying all the combinations, I'm not sure that the solution he came up with really works for me. I saw a review by a fellow named Brian Kahn that I think sums up the conclusion of this game just about perfectly. Game, you are caught in a possibly unbreakable cycle of evil. Do you break it? Me, yes. Game, okay. I mean, that's how it works. You just pick your way through a menu of options, and no matter how expansive a menu might be, you're gonna feel like it's inadequate. And this wasn't even a particularly expansive menu. You're told, here are 3 ways you can think about this. Which one do you want?
Yeah.
And then you get no response, which basically turns it into an Oulipo exercise. Make your own sonnet by assembling these lines. Or the modern equivalent, which is fridge magnet poetry. Victor is basically just handing us some chunks of language and saying, all right, assemble your own philosophical dialogue. And you won't get any feedback. It'll just be sitting there on your fridge.
You're right. I never thought about until just this moment how that ending style undermines this guy's entire internal monologue, that he is engaged in a struggle and that it's a cycle that's impossible for him to break. The part of me who just really despises this character and his narcissism wants it to be deliberate. Like, he could choose to break this cycle at any time and it would be just that easy. But I'm not sure what's an intention of the gameplay and what's just me finding some meaning in that after the fact.
You've mentioned the way the gargoyle talks about how you've been here so many times already, and you think, but this is the first time I've played. And of course, that will always be the case the first time someone plays the game. And this moment speaks to 2 different levels. On the one hand, that's the behavioral loop this guy is going through. He rapes his daughter every night, he feels guilty, he swears to himself that it'll be the last time, and then the next night, there he is crossing the hall to his daughter's room. But of course, at the same time, it's a commentary on interactive fiction, in that especially back in the days of puzzle games, you had to play a game 50 or 100 times in order to have one successful playthrough. And so, you've been here dozens of times before is part and parcel of the medium, and it's very meta. And there have been countless games that have addressed this. I've written multiple games that played with this idea. Endless Nameless in particular, but also Varicella, also Shrapnel. And for something like this, you're not just coming back over and over to make more headway on a puzzle, but like the gargoyle says, you're trying all the different combinations. The gargoyle tells you, you've tried killing the wolf, you've tried calming the wolf, you've tried commiserating with the wolf, you've tried being friendly to the gargoyle, you've tried being hostile to the gargoyle, etc., etc. And so I think that to an extent, this moment deconstructs the very idea of the ethical dilemma game. The philosophy of the ethical dilemma game is that you will learn something about yourself by being presented with choices and seeing what choices you're inclined to pick. And I can see where that comes from. I feel like I learned something about myself by playing the game Civilization, in that I discovered that I was always trying to bait other civilizations into attacking me because I just couldn't find it in myself to launch a war of aggression. It always had to be a righteous war of retaliation. But that just isn't how ethical dilemma games work, at least not the ones I've encountered so far. I don't know who plays one time and says, hey, I did learn something about myself. I think it's a rare player for whom completing a game means finding one path from the beginning to the end. I think that for most players, truly completing the game means seeing everything there is to see in the game. And so that means that instead of making decisions, players will try killing the wolf, and they will try calming the wolf, and they will try commiserating with the wolf, and the game recognizes this. But that said, it doesn't seem to have much to say about how to combat this basic flaw in interactive stories that are based on ethical and philosophical choices. And you get the last word. What's your verdict on The Baron?
Overall, I think this game really horrified me, and I kind of wish I could apply the brain bleach to get it out of my memory now. So I think that if that's what the game is aiming for, then it really sets out to achieve what it's trying to do. I respect the craft of the game, and I respect how much the game made me think, and how it's tied to all these different issues, and especially how it's in conversation with all the anti-hero stuff that was coming out at the time. But it isn't the kind of game that I think I would replay or recommend to a friend. And a lot of it's just because of the fact that, as we were talking about earlier in the conversation, just for me, the handling of the subject matter wasn't very surprising or fresh. And I don't like how it took agency away from the victims in the story. It's the kind of story that I worry about inadvertently glorifying or romanticizing this kind of crime. And maybe part of it for me is just because I work with this age group, and, so it's just kind of hard to read a story like this about the age group that I see every day and I really deeply love and care about. So that's kind of where I am. Lots of positives. And if the author of this game is out there listening to this podcast, I just want to say thank you to him for giving me a chance to play his game and discuss it like this, because I know it's always hard to put yourself out there as an author, and especially when you write a game like this.
Next up, we have Delightful Wallpaper by Andrew Plotkin, better known in some circles as Zarf, who wrote this game under the pseudonym Edgar O. Weird, for reasons that will become apparent. It came in 6th place in the 2006 comp, which normally wouldn't qualify it for this show, but it won a whole raft of zizzies: Best Writing, Best Puzzles, Best Individual Puzzle, and Best Player Character. It also won Miss Congeniality of the 2006 comp, which is the vote by other contest entrants. And back to talk about it with me is Alex Hoffer. So, you were in the very last episode before the hiatus, but that still means it's been over 5 years since your last appearance on the show. So, what's new in Alex Land since 2018?
It hasn't been too different. I did change jobs. So I used to be a QA engineer, software tester, and now I am doing developer relations at a different company. But, they're both jobs in the tech industry. I still live in San Francisco. I moved from the east side of San Francisco to the west side of San Francisco, which, if you live in San Francisco, is dramatic. But if you don't live in San Francisco, I'm sure it seems like a very silly, small change. I think one of the biggest differences is I have changed my opinion about the weather now that I live on the west side of the city, which is very foggy and cold rather than the sunny east side. Previously, I said that I wanted extreme weather. And last year, I was flooded out of my house for 6 months and had to move back in with my mom in Connecticut while the house was repaired. So I no longer have a strong love of extreme weather, but I do love the clouds and the fog out here. So it's great. I really like it.
Yeah, I do not do well in the heat, but luckily I just sort of randomly wound up in one of the coldest little microclimates in the Bay Area. More than a few times it's been 30 degrees cooler here than it's been 5 miles away on the other side of the hills, and 15 degrees cooler than it is just 2 miles away on the Berkeley campus. And I have no good segue from that to Delightful Wallpaper, so I will now ask very abruptly what Delightful Wallpaper is about.
So I believe Delightful Wallpaper describes itself as a cozy mansion mystery in the making, which confused me a little bit because when you start out, there is no mystery other than maybe the mystery of what is the mystery and what am I supposed to be doing here. It's clearly a game in two parts. So there are two very defined halves to this game. There is a first half in which you are exploring the mansion in which the game is set and trying to get from point A to point B, which is a very convoluted process that I'm sure we'll get into. And then once you've gotten to point B, there is a second part in which you are trying to orchestrate a variety of events by manipulating various people who appear in the mansion. It's a little hard to describe because it's done in a way that I've never really seen in a game before or since, but I'm sure we'll get into that as well.
So as you mentioned, this is one of those games in which figuring out what's going on is a big part of what the game is. I remember that I walked into the mansion and wandered around a bit, and the first time I tried to pick up an object, the game told me that manipulation of gross material substance is not your forte, which I took to mean that I was a big snob. You know, Primo Vericella would say something like that.
Oh.
You're scarcely about to interact with gross material substance. How unseemly. But before long, I discovered that I couldn't interact with anything. And so I thought, oh, he's actually being pretty literal, and I can't pick up stuff. So am I a ghost? And then I looked at myself, which is normally something I do right away. I don't know why I didn't do it this time. And the game said that I was cadaverously thin, clad in black with a stovepipe hat. And I thought, oh, maybe I'm more than a ghost. Maybe I'm a grim reaper of some sort. And then, just to spoil everything, when I got into the second half and realized that this was an Edward Gorey tribute, I remembered, oh, that skeletal guy on the cover of the Gashly Crumb Tinies. I'm playing that guy.
Oh, okay. I need to go back and look at the cover. Yeah, I didn't connect that. I finished the game and I'm still not 100% sure exactly who the PC is, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I'm sort of jumping the gun a bit. The two halves of the game are distinct enough that we probably shouldn't bounce around. So why don't you start us off with your take on the first half?
Sure. So before I first picked up this game, you sent me an email saying, hey, you can pick one of these two games. Let me know if you've played either of them before, because you should pick a game that you haven't played. And the Delightful Wallpaper was on the list. And I said, well, I think I picked it up and maybe I played it for like 10 minutes and then I put it down. So I should pick that one because I don't think the 10 minutes that I played counts. And I'd like some more incentive to actually get through the game and dig into it. So I picked it up again for this podcast, and yeah, I completely see why I bounced right off of it. The beginning of the game is not very appealing to me. It actually reminds me a little bit of the first game that I talked with you about for this podcast, The Moonlit Tower. Both of them start out, you are in a place, I think was the way you described it. And you don't really know what the character's goal is. The character seems to have a goal, but you, the player, aren't privy to that. You can't really do anything. And you keep walking into walls. In the case of the Moonlit Tower, it was because I couldn't figure out where any of the exits were. And in the case of Delightful Wallpaper, it's because the exits keep changing every time you walk through the room. And then you get a cute message about how you can't go through walls. Although at least in the case of Delightful Wallpaper, you have reason to think that maybe you could go through walls. I also went through a period of thinking that maybe the PC was a ghost, but apparently not. So yeah, I did not enjoy the first part of this game. And then eventually, after poking around a little bit, you figure out that it's a maze of the format where walking through the maze in certain ways changes the state of the entrances and exits so that you have to take a particular path that will open the right doors so that you can go through the doors to get to the place that you want to go to. And I did feel like I gave it, maybe not the strongest effort that I am capable of as a human, but I tried. And then at some point, I was just randomly walking in circles, hoping that I would trigger the mechanism that would cause a new note to appear in the notepad. So the way the first part works is that whenever your character triggers a state change in the map that you haven't triggered before, and then the game automatically adds that piece of information to the notepad. So you can kind of tell if you're making progress by things being added to the notepad, and then you can look at the notepad to see what movements trigger which doors and gates and stuff. And I don't know, I just kind of got to the point where I was walking in circles and I was like, this is dumb. And I went and I got a walkthrough so that I could follow it. But then I made a mistake because as soon as the walkthrough got me to a room that I hadn't seen before, I was like, okay, I'm going to leave the walkthrough and I'm going to start exploring by myself. But that was obviously a huge mistake because the nature of this maze is that if you do anything wrong, then the walkthrough becomes useless because you put the game into the wrong state. So then I got stuck again. So I was like, oh no. And I restarted the game and I just did the walkthrough verbatim and I wasn't even reading any of the descriptions. And yeah, that was how I got through the first part. I'm sure some people enjoyed it. I did not.
Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, mazes have a venerable history in IF, all the way back to the phrase twisty little passages. And in the early days, at least, each maze had to top the last, so by the time we get to the end of the Infocom era, we have the Leather Goddesses of Phobos maze, where you not only have to find your way through the maze, but you have to hop and clap and whatnot at just the right moments. So here we have the next level on top of that, where the maze isn't just a maze, but a very complicated piece of clockwork. So even if you try to map it out on a piece of graph paper, that's not going to help too much because you have to run around in exactly the right set of circles to make the doors open and close the right way, and make the elevators ascend and descend the right way. And it feels like the sort of thing where back in the day you paid your $40 and thought, okay, I've got 3 months of entertainment on my hands here as I spend an hour every evening trying to figure this out, so I'm getting my money's worth. But I can't really even imagine having the patience for that. I was pretty thrown when I started into this game and realized that, hey, I've looked at every room, I'm not allowed to interact with objects, so there is literally nothing left that I can do. So I went to the walkthrough and discovered that the order in which you visit the rooms can change the map. So you can find new locations one at a time. And I realized, oh, I'm supposed to figure out this clockwork, and I'm not doing that. Life is too short. So, like you said, I went to the walkthrough, I typed it in verbatim, I didn't even really read the descriptions. I think the key thing that Zarf was trying to show off was that back in the Infocom days, you would have had to write down all your discoveries about how the clockwork works on your graph paper. But Delightful Wallpaper takes those notes for you on a little notepad that automatically updates itself because the 80s are over. It's 2006 and text games are friendlier now.
That did not feel friendly at all, though. It just felt like the game was maybe taking care of some of the thinking for me, but it didn't make the puzzle any more fun. And this actually goes into my thesis about this game, which is that I think the game would be better, or might have been better, if there were no notebook in it. If the game were just simpler so that you didn't have to have the notebook and you didn't have to take those notes, and then the notebook were removed so you had to do it all by yourself, I think that might have been a better game design. And I think this is particularly the case in the second part of the game, but I think it might be true in the first part too.
Yeah, this might not be a very generous thought, but I'm sort of working under the assumption that this game is less about providing a fun player experience than about showing off, hey, look at the cool tricks that I can code up in this brand new language in Form 7.
Oh, did this happen right after Inform 7 came out? As someone who doesn't write the games, I was definitely not keeping track of the technological advancements.
Yeah, my understanding is that both this game and Float Point by Emily Short were put forward, at least in part, to say, hey, we're big names in IF, and we're early adopters of this new language, and we want to show you what it's capable of. Zarf actually released the Inform 7 source code for this game, And he says you're not allowed to use any of his game text, but that you're welcome to grab any of the routines and incorporate them into your own game. But for me, I mean, Inform 7 was after my time. Even when I came back in 2011 to write Endless Nameless, I did it in Inform 6. And if I were to ever come back and do another text game, I'd probably still use Inform 6 because I know how it works.
Now that I'm a developer relations engineer, my job is to convince folks like you, no, Inform 7 is amazing. It's totally worth doing all the work to learn it.
Well, you might have your work cut out for you in my case, because smartphones have been around for almost 20 years now, and I still don't have one of those. But yeah, Zarf did get on the Inform 7 train right away, and on top of showing off what that new language could do, there's also the fact that his previous game was The Dreamhold, which was covered here back in episode 5, and that was also in large part a showcase for ways to make IF a little easier for newcomers to get the hang of. And again, I mentioned Float Point a minute ago, and Emily filled that game with all sorts of cool tricks to make life easier. Like you could just say, go to such and such an object, and the game's pathfinding algorithms would take you to the last place you saw it. She really took a lot of the tedium out of traversing the map. And yeah, I guess based on this maze, Zarf wasn't quite as interested in taking out the tedium.
Yeah, the first half is perhaps an exercise in injecting tedium and exploring a space. But I don't know, some people seem to really like it.
Yes, and I do want to talk about the reviews by people who loved the maze, but first let's cover what's going on in the second half.
The second half is, in my opinion, much more fun. So in the second half, you have summoned a cast of characters to this house. And they all are interacting with each other. They're in various rooms. There's sort of this weird temporal effect where they can be in multiple rooms doing different things from your perspective at the same time, because you're seeing time in sort of a non-traditional way. So things that happen earlier or later from your perspective are all happening simultaneously. And there are also these things called intentions that are around the mansion, and you have to pick them up and put them into the right places. So an intention might reflect something that a character wants or their emotional state, and you have to put it into a place where that desire or emotional state will be manifested into an action, and then that action ends up happening, and then that moves the interactions of the characters forward. It's a bit difficult to explain. It's not as confusing when you actually play it as it is to explain how it works.
Yeah, it's tricky to explain because it's not just that time is frozen. Each room is frozen in the moment when the most interesting stuff was happening in that room. So for instance, in the conservatory, we see a little girl in the middle of playing with a bell. And then you walk out into the hall, and that same little girl is there also, and she's looking for the bell, which she has lost. So you gather, oh, this frozen moment is either earlier or later than that other frozen moment. It's different slices of the timeline, sort of the way that a CT scan consists of different slices of the scanned body.
I think you're right about that, but I did not actually try to think through it to figure out how it worked.
Yeah, once I got a grip on what was going on, I thought I knew where it was going. I'd set everything up, I'd place all the intentions in various spots, and then maybe I'd wave my hands or press a button or something, and bam, time would start to flow, and I'd see a little movie play out. And probably it wouldn't be the best movie, so I'd have to reload and optimize.
Yeah, so that structure would be a little bit more like, say, Lock and Key, in which you do, in the beginning, right, set everything up. It's been a little while since I played it, but you set everything up right, and then you kind of press the button and the Rube Goldberg machine starts moving. But yeah, no, not not here.
Yeah, I did see that a lot of reviews did compare Delightful Wallpaper to Lock and Key, which, for folks who weren't following IF in 2002, is a game that I put out that year. And yes, the way that it works is that in the first half, you build a dungeon by loading it up with a sequence of traps, and then in the second half, an adventurer tries to escape from your dungeon. And the first half dozen times, he'll probably be successful. So you watch a generated story about the way that he evades your traps, and that's where I thought that Delightful Wallpaper was going. But it turns out that Delightful Wallpaper may actually be closer to the idea that evolved into Lock and Key. And the story there is that my girlfriend at the time and I were living in New York, and we started talking about what about a game that had no player character whatsoever? Like, we set up a neighborhood and a certain suboptimal scene plays out. Like, a dog busts through a fence and mauls a pedestrian. And what you would do would be to make minor changes to the environment. Open or close a window, or latch or unlatch a gate, or move a cat from one patio to another, and see what arrangement leads to the happiest outcome. So Delightful Wallpaper seems like it's partway between that idea and what Lock and Key eventually became. It does have a player character of sorts, but not one who exists in the world the same way as these other characters, the Viscount and the Butler and all these other folks. And again, the big difference is that both with Lock and Key and with that neighborhood game that eventually evolved into Lock and Key, you were supposed to see the scene play out. And in Delightful Wallpaper, that does not happen.
Yeah. What you were describing a minute ago sounds sort of like a God game or a simulation game. And this game also, in some ways, feels like a God game. Maybe not quite a simulation game. It's not really simulationist because you're only manipulating the character's actions and not the actual environment itself, really.
Yeah, the only God game that I ever played was the first one, Populous, back in the early 90s. But that was about an interventionist god. And the game I had in mind called for something more like a deist god. Set the initial conditions, set off the big bang, and then sit back and watch the show. But in Delightful Wallpaper, there is no big bang and there is no show.
Well, I did feel that the second half, I just jumped right in. I was like, okay, that first half, not fun, but like the second half, this is about understanding interpersonal relationships. Like, I can do this. Awesome. And I started running around the house and picking up the intentions and putting the intentions in different places. And I was having a fun time. And I was just trying to move the story forward. That's all I thought that I was trying to do. So it's like, pick up an intention and then put it in a place where it's going to cause something dramatic to happen. So if there are two characters who have a reason to dislike each other, put an intention for them to fight in the room where they are, and that'll cause a fight, and that'll be drama, and it'll move the story forward. And I was just like running around, having a blast. Part of the puzzle nature of this part of the game is, one, you have to figure out where you can place an intention, where it would be appropriate. But also there are some places where you can put multiple different intentions, or there are some intentions that can be put in multiple different places. And you have to settle on a configuration that works. And what it turns out when I was playing this was that I didn't understand what works meant. And I was just so into it and running so far forward that I didn't read the information that you were supposed to read. And I had put all of the intentions in places and I was like, okay, I won, right? But nothing happened. And I was a little bit confused at that point. But it turns out that that's not what you're supposed to do. And that actually you're supposed to put the intentions in places that will lead the characters to their deaths, which completely went over my head for the entire game. I was just trying to make stuff happen. But it did in retrospect make more sense because, for example, two of the characters are children. And I was thinking, like, I can't figure out how these children are going to relate to the interpersonal relationships because they really don't seem to have any connection to the various fights and affairs and liaisons that are happening in the house. It's quite comic. I think the Viscount is sleeping with like how many characters? Like 3 or 4?
I think every adult.
Yeah. So when I was looking at the influences, I originally said the ghastly Crumptinies, but I actually think there's a little bit of the Curious Sofa as well, which is Edward Gorey's quote unquote pornographic work, in which there's no actual pornography, but there are various activities that are hinted at or suggested, but not shown on the page. And this seemed to have a similar sensibility. But yeah, I was just trying to make drama happen. And so I was very confused about what to do with some of the intentions because I didn't see how they related to the drama because the children die in accidents. They're not killed by the other characters. And it turns out this happened because I did not look at the notebook at all during the second half because I felt like I didn't need to. I was making progress. I knew what I needed to do. And the game wasn't telling me that the notebook was updating like it did in the first part. So I was like, cool. But then it turns out that when you do look at the notebook, it actually has sort of this poem that has fairly strong hints about what kinds of events you need to make happen. And that was very useful in placing some of the final intentions, which otherwise are quite difficult to figure out. But once I read it, I was like, oh, this is way too easy. Like you meant I was supposed to have access to these hints the entire time. But that would make all of the puzzles so easy. So then I was able to place the final intentions in the right places and read the poem. And it wasn't until literally the "you have won" text appeared that I was like, oh, this is like an Edward Gorey story. Oh, I bet if I anagram the pseudonym that Zarf wrote this under, it'll anagram to Edward Gorey. Yeah, how about that? So I was glad I realized it eventually, but it was kind of weird to not quite get what kind of game you're playing until literally after you've won the game.
I think I was a little bit clearer on the goal and that somewhere along the line I did pick up the notion that the characters were vying for some sort of inheritance or something, and that they wanted to knock each other off. And I did look at the notepad, and I did notice that as you place intentions successfully, the notes turned into rhyming couplets. And I thought, okay, I've seen these kinds of couplets before. This is Edward Gorey, right? Because my friend Nicole lent me Amphigory back in college, and his style was distinctive enough that all these years later it clicked pretty much immediately. So I figured that, okay, this is going to be pretty ghoulish, and we're even going to be offing the children. But again, I figured that I was bound to place the intentions less than optimally, and time would start back up as I placed the last one, and maybe only 2 of the characters would die, and I'd be told, you weren't a grim enough Reaper, try again. But it turns out that instead of the lock and key approach of showing players their amusing failures, Delightful Wallpaper just doesn't let you fail. Since I'd used the walkthrough for the maze, I didn't want to follow it for the second part. I did have the walkthrough open, but I thought, okay, I'm going to deliberately deviate from this so that I can see what a wrong outcome looks like before I see what the right outcome looks like. But it turns out that if you try to place an intention in a spot that doesn't fit one of the solutions, and at least there are multiple solutions, so that's something. But if it doesn't fit any of them, the game just doesn't let you do it. It says, that is not the right place. So that's not fun. And after the 10,000th time of being told that I'd picked the wrong place, I wrote in my notes that this game is basically a frustration device.
I felt that way for some of the intentions before I read the notebook. So one of the intentions is a glass of champagne. And I kept trying to give the champagne to everybody. And every time it would say, they don't look like a champagne person. What? I don't get it. And then almost out of desperation, I gave the champagne to the little boy because I was like, I don't know, he's kind of swinging off the chandelier. Maybe it's because he's drunk, or maybe he's just rambunctious and we get into the champagne. And that actually did turn out to be the right answer. So great, but it's not like he looks like a champagne person either. But yeah, without having the clue from the notebook that he was the right person to give it to, the error message did not make a whole lot of sense. But it is possible to have a wrong answer in which you do put the intentions in a place. So in my first stab at a solution, Pun not intended. In my first stab at a solution, I think one of the characters got killed twice and one of the characters didn't get killed at all. So it is possible to put the intentions in superfluous places and also not win in that way. But yeah, some of the messaging that it gives you when you're trying to place an intention and it doesn't work is quite frustrating, especially if you don't understand what the game is doing. I think also the one about the little girl, when I kept trying to give her the bell that she's looking for, and it says Cousin Jay wouldn't just give her the bell. I'm like, what? Why not? That's so strange. And yes, if it allowed you to place more intentions in places where they didn't work, it would possibly be a more satisfying game because you could see and understand why it wasn't working rather than the game just telling you, hey, like, that doesn't work, try something else.
I feel as though this is probably the thing I find myself saying more than anything else on this show, but I'll say it again. I get the feeling that Zarf didn't want you to be able to place the intentions in the wrong spots because that way lies combinatorial explosion. All the rooms times all the characters times all the intentions means a lifetime of writing out all the different possible outcomes. And no author wants to do that, which is totally understandable. I've given talks about how I tried to head off combinatorial explosion when I was writing Endless Nameless. Like I say that this spell only works on organic materials, and now I don't have to write a custom response if you try to use it on a rock or a coin or a sword. So I get it. The problem, I would argue, is that combinatorial explosion, or at least combinatorial exploration, is where the fun of IF is. Like in Float Point, a lot of the fun was trying all the different combinations of gifts and clothes to see what concluding vignette you get. In Delightful Wallpaper, it would be fun to see a bunch of different ways things could go wrong. Just being told, nope, that's not the solution, isn't fun. And again, that's why I was happy to discover that at least there were multiple ways things could go right. Like the hint on your notepad told you to kill off the little girl by having Cousin Jay throw her bell down the well, but you can also get rid of her by having him throw it under the stove.
Oh, really? But stove doesn't rhyme with bell. How does that work?
You get a different rhyme.
Whoa, okay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you said, if the maze is too hard, then, at least if you use the notepad, the murder spree is too easy. Because you start with the note, little v, la la bell, something something, down the well. And that kind of gives away the store. And the completed rhyme doesn't add much. Little girl with silver bell, lost it down the garden well. Little girl she followed after, trailing silver bubbling laughter. But if you go completely off script and hide the bell under the stove, you get a rhyme that overwrites the notes. It goes, little girl did laugh and rove, lost her bell beneath the stove. Little girl she burned to follow, to her toys knew hidey hollow.
That is pretty cool. I had no idea. I knew that there were multiple solutions, but I thought that they were just all about, well, character A gets stabbed and character B gets poisoned or vice versa. I didn't realize there was that much depth in them. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, the thing here is that if you're not consulting the notepad as you successfully place intentions, then your game ends with a full Edward Gorey-style poem about all these characters meeting ignominious ends getting recited to you out of nowhere. And that's a reasonably good payoff. But if you play like I did, and you consult the notepad every 3 turns, and every time you place an intention in a place that works, you see the corresponding couplet click into place, then just having your notepad read back to you when you looked at it 3 turns ago is not a very good reward.
No. Yeah, and this is why I feel like if the game had just made it more clear what the goal is, and I think that this is frustrating because you do need the notebook, or at least I needed the notebook to understand what I was supposed to be achieving, even though I think I could have actually then figured out how to achieve those steps without using it. If the game had made it clear that you're supposed to kill all these characters or lead them to their deaths, then I think it could have dispensed with the notebook and been a more satisfying puzzle and, like you were saying, a more satisfying reward as well by getting this poem as a reward for solving it.
And I think that takes us back to your opening remark about the you are in a place style of game. It does seem as though this is one of the many games I've played over the years in which the fundamental puzzle is figuring out who you are and what you're doing. Whereas back in the day, I used to get condescended at by people in the news groups because in my games, I would just say flat out that you're Primo Vericella and your goal is to become the Regent of Piedmont. Or you're Jonathan Kent and your goal is to get Allie Dawson to go to the dance with you. There was a guy named Stephen Marsh in particular who scolded me that if I had any sophistication, I would make players discover who they were by picking up on clues in the world of the game, which is what led me to write 905.
That's pretty funny. I feel like probably the critical consensus has shifted since then, or at least I hope so. I mean, obviously there's a place for both types of game, but I don't really think that in this one being all squirrely and secretive about what the deal is with the PC was really leading up to a payoff the way I've seen it do sometimes. I think sometimes even in Czar's other games.
Yeah, even Spider and Web started off by saying, "Oh, you're just a tourist." But since we've started talking about how the audience has viewed these figure out the scenario type of games, let's talk about the reception of this one in particular. Because after I finished it, I read some reviews, and I don't think any of the reviews I found said, "Oh, I loved this game entirely." And I don't think any of them said, "Oh, I hated this game entirely." They seem to be split almost 50-50 between those that said, "Oh, the maze was great, but I hated the murder plot, so just play the maze and then quit." I even saw some people make ethical objections, like Lucian Smith said something like, "I got to the second half, I discovered I was supposed to murder a child, and I'm not doing that. Quit."
I wonder what he'd think of the Baron.
Yeah. So then on the other hand, you had the folks who said, "Oh, the murder plot is so interesting. What a cool idea for a game. But I hated the maze." So everyone, just use the walkthrough for the maze. It takes 2 minutes to type in the commands and then just save once the maze is done and play the rest of the game for real. And to the extent that I enjoyed the game at all, I was in that second camp. I've already talked about how I would have liked to have seen it done differently, but the maze, I wouldn't try to fix it. I'd just cut it out. Figuring out all that clockwork, it's in the same box as the sorts of games where you're supposed to fix your spaceship. And those are not for me, because I'm not a mechanical engineer. But yeah, I came away from this game feeling like one of the most interesting things about Delightful Wallpaper is that it's practically a personality test.
Exactly. Yeah. I think when we were comparing notes, we both independently used the phrase personality test in our assessment of the game. Yeah, I think the only reviews I saw where people just flat out hated the game were people who never made their way through the maze and didn't use the walkthrough. And so all they saw was the first half and they didn't like the first half. Yeah, sometimes I feel like Zarf is like the only person in the world who would really enjoy both halves of this game equally. And maybe he doesn't even enjoy both halves equally.
Actually, that's really interesting to me because so often I'll read or see an interview with artists in all sorts of media and they'll say something like, "Oh, I just write the sort of books I'd like to read," or "I make the movies I'd always wished I could see," or "I play music I'd want to hear." Or even on my beloved MasterChef Australia, the judges are always saying, "Stop trying to impress us and cook the sort of food you'd want to eat. That'll make your dishes 1,000 times better." And I feel like I'm an exception here, at least where my IF is concerned. Like in The Baron, when I encountered the gargoyle and it said, "Oh, you've been here so many times before," I sort of rolled my eyes and said, "Oh boy, here we go, getting all meta." But half my games have moments almost exactly like that. So what I would enjoy playing and what I write are often not the same. And I've actually heard that too. The opposite of the interviews I mentioned before. You've got the chef at the Michelin-starred Italian restaurant who says, "Oh, I only eat Chinese food. After cooking Italian all night, that's the last thing I want to eat myself." Or the rock star from the 1990s who says, "Oh, I only listen to jazz from the 1930s." So I wonder whether this is an example of Zarf writing a game he would like to play, or whether he's more like, well, this is the sort of game that I'm good at writing, but I'd rather be playing something radically different, like Remises.
Huh. You're going to have to get him on the show and ask. I do think that there is a difference, by the way, not to make this a segment about the Baron, but I think there's a pretty big difference between how the Baron approaches this meta content.
Oh, yeah, I mean, of course. The Baron isn't talking just about IF tropes, but also about the cycle of abuse. So, yeah, I'm being a little facile there.
I was going to say you were being too hard on yourself. But, yeah, that too. But yeah, I'm actually curious. So, like, since you brought it up, are there games that you have written that you don't think you would enjoy playing?
Oh, I probably wouldn't have the patience for the lock and key puzzle. And there's no way on earth that I'd be able to make much headway in Varicella. In both cases, I tried to make it so that there's enough darkly amusing text along the way that you get something out of losing playthroughs. So I might play through them a few times just for that, but I doubt I'd ever get anywhere near a winning playthrough on my own. Shrapnel I would probably find half-baked and overly meta. And actually, not that long ago, I started up Narcolepsy and poked around in it, almost 20 years after it came out now, and I ended up getting stuck. I didn't remember what all the event triggers were, and even brute forcing it didn't work. I went to every location I could find trying to get the next story event to launch, and no luck. Which is the exact thing John Ingold complained about back when the game came out. So if his experience in 2003 was anything like mine in 2023, I can see why he titled his review Grrr.
That's funny on multiple levels. Because I feel like John Ingold has he's written Make It Good, right? Which is the game that I most wish that I could solve but can't.
Well, that's coming up. I see it on the 09 list. But I should make it clear, it's not like writing those games was some sort of grim task. I really enjoyed devising and programming the puzzles in Varicella and Lock and Key. I just wouldn't want to play through them myself.
Yeah, it's funny because, hearing your opinions from doing these podcasts and listening to other people's segments, it's clear that you're not very excited about puzzle games in general most of the time. And also, I think you kind of have a reputation from Photopia as the guy who makes the puzzle list games. But actually, Varicella and Lock and Key are, I think, really, really great puzzle games. So I was kind of curious about how you thought about that.
Well, thanks. And the thing is, as much as I don't like solving most IF puzzles, I'm very glad that there are those out there who do, because it gave me an audience for those puzzles you mentioned, and like I said, they were really fun to design. So, any last thoughts on Delightful Wallpaper?
I think that's everything.
Then that wraps it up for Ask Tell number 15, and number 14, and 2006. Many thanks to my guests for the last couple of shows, Rachel K. Jones and Alex Hoffer, and to the authors of the games, Victor Heispers and Andrew Plotkin. And thank you for listening. Next, we will finally move on to 2007. My understanding is that in both Chinese astrology and interactive fiction, it was the year of the pig. But I guess we'll see. Till then.